America alone, how Iran is dismantling the alliance. As of this morning, March 17, 2026, the President of the United States has personally contacted 7 allied nations and asked them to deploy warships to the Strait of Hormuz. Every single one said no publicly, on the record. Trump posted on Truth Social calling on China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others to send their navies. When that produced no response, he told the Financial Times that a refusal would be, in his words, very bad for the future of NATO. When that also produced no response, US Ambassador to the United Nations. Mike Waltz went on television and used language that deserves to be examined carefully. He said the United States welcomes, encourages, and even demands allied participation. That is not the language of a partner requesting help. That is the language of a government that has run out of options. Then White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters that these nations should contribute because they are, and this is her exact phrasing, benefiting greatly from the United States military taking out the threat of Iran. Translation: we started this war alone, we need you to treat it as a shared victory, and we need you to send your ships into the firing line to prove it. Not one country said yes, and it did not stop at the 7, he asked. Germany, Greece, Italy, and Spain all went on record refusing without even being named in the original request. We need to talk about why every single ally rejected this call, what that tells us about where this conflict is heading, and how Iran is using control of the strait to pull America's partners away from Washington and toward Tehran. Here is what we know from this morning. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer held a press conference and said plainly, "We will not be drawn into the wider war." He added that this was never envisioned to be a NATO mission. Trump's response was personal. He mocked Starmer for saying he needed to consult his team before making a decision. Trump said, and this is a direct quote, "You do not need to meet with your team. You are the prime minister that is a sitting American president publicly ridiculing the leader of America's closest ally for following basic democratic process." Germany's defense minister Boris Pistorius gave a 7-word response that carries more weight than any policy paper. "This is not our war. We have not started it." Foreign Minister Johann Wadeful went further, stating that Berlin expects Washington and Tel Aviv to inform them, include them, and tell them when their goals are achieved. That is not the language of an ally hedging. That is the language of a government demanding to be treated as something other than a cleanup crew. France hedged but functionally refused. President Macron referenced a possible future mission when circumstances permit. The circumstance he is waiting for is the end of hostilities, which means he has agreed to nothing during the only window that actually matters. Canada declined, Australia's transport minister said the United States had not formally asked for support and Canberra was not prepared to offer it. Japan said it is reviewing its options within the scope of Japanese law but has no plans to send ships. Greece said no. Italy's foreign minister said diplomacy must prevail. Spain's defense minister Margarita Robles delivered what may be the sharpest rejection of all. She said Spain will never accept any stopgap measures because the objective must be for the war to end and for it to end now. Then the European Union weighed in collectively. Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas gathered EU foreign ministers in Brussels. Afterward, she said there was no appetite to extend the EU's naval mission into Hormuz and added four words that summarize the entire situation. Nobody wants to go. 0 countries have committed forces. That is where things stand. But the rejection itself is only half the picture. We need to understand why every single one of these nations calculated that refusing the United States was the safer bet, because this is not about political grandstanding. It is not about European leaders playing to domestic audiences. The refusal is structural. It follows a logic so consistent across a dozen capitals that it reveals something broken at the foundation of the entire alliance system. The first and deepest reason is the total absence of prior consultation. In the days before February 28th, Trump reportedly told Gulf Arab eyes the entire operation would be finished in 4 days total capitulation. His chief economic advisor Kevin Hassett repeated a 4 to 6 week timeline on the Sunday shows and insisted the administration was ahead of schedule. That timeline has since been directly contradicted by Israel's own military, which announced this week that the war will last at least 3 more weeks with thousands of targets remaining. What is clearly visible now is that key allies felt they had been given no clarity about war aims, timelines, or the conditions for ending the conflict. As Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna put it bluntly, what will be the plan? The Wall Street Journal reported this week that the administration planned to announce a convoy coalition as early as today, but buried in that same reporting was a detail that undermines the entire announcement. The nations involved are still debating whether operations would begin before or after a ceasefire, if the coalition only activates after the fighting stops. It is not a wartime alliance. It is a cleanup agreement dressed up as a show of force. The second reason is the relationship itself. For years, Trump targeted these same allies with tariffs, withdrawal threats, public insults, and NATO funding ultimatums. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He called the alliance obsolete. He imposed trade penalties on European steel and aluminum. He ridiculed Macron, Merkel, and Trudeau on the world stage. And now, the first time he genuinely needs their military cooperation, he is not asking, he is threatening. He told the Financial Times that NATO faces a very bad future if countries do not comply. He told reporters, "We will remember, that is not coalition building. That is coercion from a position of weakness, and every government on that call list recognizes it for exactly what it is." The third reason is domestic politics in Europe. European voters are overwhelmingly hostile to this conflict. Energy prices were already painful from the post-Ukraine era. Brent crude has now surged past $100 a barrel. Petrol prices are climbing across every EU member state. Natural gas is spiking because Qatar's liquefied natural gas, which European nations have depended on heavily since cutting ties with Russian supply, transits the very waterway that is now effectively sealed. Any European leader who sends warships into the Persian Gulf alongside the American Navy is ending their own political career. Robles in Madrid understood that. Pistorius in Berlin understood that. Starmer in London understood that. The fourth reason runs even deeper. This war is directly enriching Russia. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kallas said it publicly. The Strait of Hormuz closure is funneling revenue into Moscow's war machine because every dollar oil climbs above 70 is another dollar funding Russia's campaign in Ukraine. And here is the part that infuriates Brussels most of all. The United States is simultaneously granting sanctions, waivers allowing India and other nations to purchase Russian crude already at sea. NATO's primary strategic concern is Russia. The war Trump is waging against Iran is financing the adversary NATO actually exists to confront, and he is asking European capitals to send destroyers to the Gulf while his own Treasury Department greenlights Russian oil sales. The contradiction is not subtle, it is policy. Even if the political will existed, the military problem is severe. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, and Iran controls the mountainous northern shoreline. Tehran has spent decades preparing to threaten shipping there with mines, missiles, drones, fast attack craft, and layered asymmetric capabilities. The U.S. military has already announced it destroyed 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait, which illustrates how quickly any escort mission could become a direct shooting war. There is also a recent precedent that no defense ministry has forgotten: the Red Sea. The Houthi disruption was a smaller-scale preview of exactly this scenario. A non-state militia with a fraction of Iran's capabilities shut down one of the busiest shipping corridors on Earth. Two administrations launched strikes. Biden admitted the strikes were not working and continued them anyway. Trump did the same and eventually walked away. The Red Sea was never fully secured. Every allied military strategist drew one conclusion from that episode. If the full power of the American Navy could not reopen the Red Sea against the Houthis, no patchwork coalition is going to hold the Strait of Hormuz against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which fields anti-ship ballistic missiles, fast attack craft, submarines, and a coastal missile network hardened over for decades of preparation for precisely this confrontation. Now, the part that most coverage has missed entirely: Iran is not simply blocking the strait. Iran is using it as a sorting mechanism. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went on CBS and stated it plainly. The Strait of Hormuz is open. It is only closed to American, Israeli, and allied vessels. Others are free to pass. Then Iran proved it. A Pakistani-flagged Aframax tanker transited the strait on March 16th carrying Abu Dhabi crude. Two Indian LPG carriers passed through safely. A Turkish vessel received clearance from Tehran. China is in direct negotiations with Iran for guaranteed passage of its crude and Qatari LNG shipments. France and the United Kingdom have reportedly opened back-channel talks with Tehran about securing passage for their own vessels. Follow that logic to its conclusion. Every allied capital now faces a binary choice: join an American convoy mission and guarantee that Iran classifies your ships as hostile targets, or negotiate directly with Tehran, stay out of the war, and keep your oil flowing. Washington is offering its partners the privilege of becoming combatants. Tehran is offering them the privilege of becoming customers. For any government making that calculation under the current conditions, the answer is not difficult. This is the strategic maneuver the administration does not appear to have anticipated. Iran has converted the strait from a military choke point into a diplomatic lever, one that is actively peeling allies away from American leadership. Every nation that negotiates with Tehran for safe passage is implicitly recognizing Iranian authority. Over that waterway, every successful transit arranged through Iranian channels is a quiet rejection of American power. The alliance is not just failing to assemble, it is being disassembled from the outside by the very adversary the war was supposed to eliminate. The economic architecture underneath all of this is collapsing in parallel. Before the war, 138 ships transited the strait daily. As of this week, UK Maritime Trade Operations reports no more than 5. Oil exports through the waterway have dropped below 10% of pre-conflict levels according to the IEA. Brent crude is trading between $102 and $116 a barrel. It touched $120 last week. On March 11th, the IEA announced the largest emergency reserve release in its 52-year history, 400 million barrels across 32 nations. The United States alone is contributing 172 million barrels from a strategic petroleum reserve that contains only 415 million total, that is 41% of America's entire emergency stockpile, being deployed to stabilize a market that has not stabilized. Crude climbed 17% in the days following the announcement. Iraq's southern oil field production has collapsed by 70%, falling from 4.3 million barrels a day to 1.3 million. Kuwait has announced precautionary output cuts. Saudi Arabia is rerouting what it can through its east-west pipeline, but that pipeline was never designed to replace the strait. The deficit stands at roughly 12 million barrels per day, and no combination of reserves, pipelines, and alternate routes can close it. And it is not only oil. Global liquefied natural gas supply has been cut by 20% because Qatar ships through the same choke point, directly undermining Europe's years-long effort to replace Russian gas. Fertilizer, helium, and uranium shipments are stalled. China has already tapped its strategic fertilizer reserve. The United States does not have one. Beyond the Gulf, the broader picture continues to fracture. North Korea fired multiple ballistic missiles into the sea during a South Korea military drills. China has increased military activity around Taiwan. The PLA is reportedly monitoring this conflict on live screens, tracking missile trajectories and strike patterns in real time. They are not intervening. They are studying. Dubai International Airport was struck by a drone today, hitting a fuel depot and forcing a temporary suspension of operations. Commercial flights turned around mid-route. Qatar intercepted a second wave of Iranian missiles this morning. Kuwait's airport remains shuttered. Abu Dhabi is running at limited capacity, and a Trump administration advisor publicly warned about the risk of nuclear escalation, a remark that stood out precisely because it brought a previously taboo scenario into open discussion. So put the full picture together. The assumption before February 28th. 4 days, total Iranian capitulation, the strait stays open, and allies fall in line. The reality at week 3, the strait is under Iranian control. Oil is above $100. The largest reserve release in history has failed to hold prices, and every allied capital Washington contacted has delivered a unanimous, public, on-the-record rejection. The assumption, regime collapse. The reality, the son of the killed supreme leader assumed power within 72 hours and declared the strait will remain sealed as leverage. The assumption, the coalition forms quickly, escorts begin, global trade resumes. The reality, not one nation has committed a single warship, and several are now negotiating directly with Tehran for the access Washington promised its coalition would provide. Iran's gamble also deserves scrutiny. Tehran framed its closure as total. The reality is selective passage granted to nations willing to deal bilaterally. That is not a blockade born of strength. It is a calculated bet that depends on the war not escalating to the point where Iran's own coastline becomes the front line. If the administration moves toward a ground seizure of Karg Island, which handles 90% of Iran's crude exports, Tehran's leverage evaporates. Iran's strategy requires that escalation does not reach that threshold. Whether that bet holds is a question neither side can answer tonight. 14 days ago, this war was framed as a demonstration of American power, a signal to the world about what happens when you challenge the United States. But there is a version of this conflict where America wins every engagement in the air and loses something far more consequential on the ground. Not territory, not soldiers. The Network of alliances, shared interests, and institutional trust that took generations to build and that no military force can reconstruct once it fractures. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not merely a shipping crisis. It is a referendum on American leadership, and as of this morning, the verdict from every allied capital is the same. America is on its own. The only question that remains is whether the next phase of this conflict is decided in Washington, in Tehran, or by the dozen governments that have just told the most powerful military on earth that it will have to figure this one out alone.